Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Mooradian. I'm the Government Relations and Policy Director for CURE. First, thank you all for being here today on such a snowy day, and a gentle reminder to please turn your phones on silent. So just a little bit about me. I have a background in environmental law. I went to law school at Vermont Law and did a lot of time there working on water and natural resources. And I've been at CURE now for almost 2 years, working on a lot of different things, but carbon capture pipelines has been a main one throughout my time there. So I'm just here to give a brief overview of what carbon capture is and its history, the history of its use in the United States. I'm going to end with a few case studies too, time permitting, but we're going to go quickly. So I welcome you to come up and see me afterwards with questions. And let's see how this goes. Okay, great. So first off, what is carbon capture? There are three main components to a carbon capture system. That includes, as this diagram shows you, capture, transport, and utilization or storage. So the capture is CO2 is captured from a point source, usually like industrial facilities, power generation, gas processing, that kind of thing. Then there's transportation. It's most often via pipeline. There are approximately 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines in the US today. None are much longer, depending on how you want to count it, than about a couple hundred, 500 miles at most. You can, in theory, transport CO2 via rail, ship, or truck, but it's widely considered to be most safe via pipeline. And then we've got sequestration or use. Most often today, as we'll get into, sequestration is actually in the form of in depleted oil and gas wells via enhanced oil recovery. Okay. But before we get too much further, I want to make sure that we understand the difference between carbon capture and carbon removal. So carbon dioxide removal is often conflated with carbon capture, but we should think about them as distinct processes. So carbon dioxide removal removes existing CO2 from the atmosphere. So if that is paired with long-term storage, we're talking about like at least 100 years, ideally longer, given the state we're in right now with climate. If you pair it with long-term storage, it could result in negative emissions, but there are lots of deciding factors that go into that, how you're powering the removal technology, for example. Carbon capture, on the other hand, captures CO2 from a point source that would otherwise have emitted CO2 into the atmosphere. So at best, carbon capture can reduce some of the CO2 emitted by an industrial process, but it's not the same as carbon removal. So here's just kind of another clarification from the IPCC. So carbon dioxide removal is necessary to achieve net zero CO2 and GHG emissions both globally and nationally, counterbalancing hard to abate residual emissions. We've heard all of that before. But CCS and CCU applied to fossil CO2 do not count as removal technologies. I just really want you all to keep that in mind as we talk about things today. This is a very truncated history of carbon capture in the US. But I think a lot of us who have been in these spaces have probably heard that CCUS, carbon capture, and related pipeline industries, they've been around for 50 plus years. So there's tons of experience with their technology. But I really want to take a moment to break that down. So it starts in the 1920s. That's when CO2 was first separated from natural gas to create saleable methane. You need to take the CO2 out to make it worth something. But then it wasn't until 1972 when that really came into kind of a more commercial-ish setting in the United States. That's when the Terrell Natural Gas Plant in Texas added CO2 capture technology onto its system. That's owned by Occidental Petroleum, and it removes CO2 from the naturally occurring natural gas reservoirs and then transports it via pipeline about 200 miles to depleted oil wells in the Permian Basin. Then we're moving along to the 1980s. One of the main ones that was introduced in the 1980s was Exxon's Chute Creek. I'm going to talk, that's one of my case studies, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But that was first operational in 1986, and that was also natural gas processing and also used for enhanced oil recovery. You might be noticing a theme. We're going to skip ahead to the 2000s. Again, There's more going on kind of in between these, but these are just big ones I want to really point out. In 2000, the Great Plains Synfuels plant got carbon capture attached to it. The plant itself was operational in 1984. And then also just kind of, we're not going to go into 45Q because that could be a whole day. But that's just a tax credit that kind of introduced the idea that capturing CO2 and either using it for enhanced oil recovery or sequestering it was worth some amount of money. In the 2010s, you can kind of see there's a big pickup in popularity for CO2 or carbon capture. Lots of facilities come online in the 2010s, and in the 2018, there were updates to 45Q that made it more lucrative to do either, again, enhanced oil recovery or dedicated sequestration. And we're going to talk about the Archer Daniels Midland facility in Illinois as one of the case studies as well. That came online in 2017. And that brings us to today. The IRA. So the IRA was phenomenal in many ways, especially as we talked about earlier for rural electric co-ops. But unfortunately, part of that also increased the amount of money that was given to carbon capture, again, both for enhanced oil recovery and for geologic sequestration. And it lowered a lot of the basic requirements so that more CO2 capture companies would be able to get money for doing arguably the bare minimum. That's a little of my own opinion there. So what is this enhanced oil recovery that I keep talking about? Well, the National Petroleum Council helpfully describes it as the injection of CO2 into the reservoir rock of an existing oil field to recover more oil and natural gas than otherwise would have been produced. I want to highlight that, okay? It's oil that more oil and natural gas than would have otherwise been produced. Currently, about 63 million tons per year of CO2 is injected for oil and enhanced oil recovery. And of the existing CO2 infrastructure, about 90% is used for enhanced oil recovery. Enhanced oil recovery also produces 4 to 6% of our nation's oil supply. So what do proponents of carbon capture have to say about enhanced oil recovery? Well, here's one quote. Currently, most CO2 EOR is done with natural underground reservoirs of CO2, yet the industry's future growth depends on taking advantage of the large amounts of CO2 that result from electricity generation in industrial processes. That's a quote from the winter 2014 issue of Cornerstone, the official journal of the world coal industry, from the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, which has been rebranded as the Carbon Capture Coalition. Here's where I've got a video. I don't know. Sorry, I should have given you a heads up, John. And if it doesn't work, I can just tell you what they say. Okay, that's totally fine. So, excellent.
Department of Mineral Resources Director Lynn Helms said more carbon dioxide will be needed in order to sustain oil production for the long term. This comes following the Public Service Commission's decision to deny a permit for the Summit Carbon Solutions CO2 pipeline. While Helms didn't comment on the matter, he said the state needs to get the gas from somewhere to help with enhanced oil recovery. The emerging technology uses CO2 to allow producers to take more oil than traditional methods. Helms said current CO2 production only meets about 10% of what is needed for enhanced oil recovery.
We've got to find a way for carbon capture and utilization to become a part of North Dakota's economy, or we will leave billions of barrels of oil in the ground.
Helms said there were 3 draft applications submitted for carbon storage facilities that would have utilized the Summit pipeline, but will now most likely be postponed.
So just was another example of industry kind of explaining what enhanced oil recovery means to them. And we'll get to the next one. Perfect. Thank you. So then here's just a final quote, again, from an industry, oil industry exec. So this is Vicki Hollab, I think, the CEO of Occidental Petroleum. She says that we believe that our direct capture technology is going to be the technology that helps to preserve our industry over time, that gives our industry a license to continue to operate for 60, 70, 80 years, that I think is going to be very much needed. So where are we with carbon capture today? Currently, there are 15 commercial CCUS projects operational in the US. Those are mostly the lighter colored circles. Those are the ones that are commercial and operational. And so the darker circles are just pilot or demonstration projects. But that's generally where they are in the US. Combined, they have a capacity to store, but remember, that's even as a byproduct of enhanced oil recovery, about 21 million tons of CO2, which is 0.34% of US annual CO2 emissions. And for some context, I've seen estimates of where we need to be with some sort of carbon removal, anywhere between 2 and 5 gigatons for the US annually, and 10 gigatons globally by 2050, or up to 20 gigatons by end of the century. A gigaton is a lot. I'm going to be honest, I went to law school because I'm not good at math, but I can definitely tell you the exact amount of that, or somebody who's better with numbers can shout it out. 1 million tons. Okay, thank you. Wasn't expecting that question today. We're good. So just a couple more things about carbon capture. We're going to get into this a little bit. I wish we had more time to fully explain some of these things, because it's easy for me to just stand here and say, yeah, they're consistently underperformed. They're expensive. The consistently underperformed, we're going to get into in my case studies. Also with the expensive. And the problem with expenses is not only the cost of building this capture technology or retrofitting it, but also you need to think about operational costs, transportation costs if we're doing pipelines, sequestration costs and long-term monitoring, because again, we need to make sure that if you're capturing carbon and you're going to store it underground, that it stays there for the long term. And it's important to also remember or understand that a lot of time, historically, a lot of these projects have been heavily helped along, funded by the federal government. They're also really energy intensive, anywhere between 10 and 40% energy penalty for using carbon capture systems. And we should really be asking, what is the source of that energy? If it's coming from more fossil fuels, then obviously that's going to be impacting its performance overall in terms of GHG emissions reductions. Also tend to be water intensive. I'm going to leave that for later. We've got a whole presentation about water impacts. And then there's also this problem of co-location. So a lot of times, as this map will show, sorry, there's a graph of costs. Not sure if that turns up super well for you guys out there, but so all of these dots are sites that could be 45Q, that tax credit eligible. And then the shaded areas on the map are potential sequestration sites. And I should note that not all of those shaded areas have been carefully studied. You would need to actually go to each of these locations and drill wells and make sure that they can hold the CO2 that you want it to. But as you can see, especially in the Midwest, there's kind of this big patch in the middle where there isn't sequestration. And so that's why we've got these pipeline proposals here. We need, in theory, to move it from the Midwest to one of these sequestration sites. You can kind of see the same thing happening in southern Appalachia. So I'm going to go into my quick, I think I'm doing all right on time. We're going to go into a quick case studies. So the first one is Chute Creek. I mentioned it earlier. This is located in LaBarge, Wyoming. The operator is ExxonMobil. It first became operational in 1986, and it cost $256 million total. The first section was about $170 million, and then they expanded in 2010, and that was another $86 million. The CO2 source for Chute Creek is natural gas processing. And initially it was able to capture about 4.3 tons per year. But then with the 2010 upgrade, it's now up to 7 million tons per year. All of that is either used for enhanced oil recovery or vented. And to date, they've captured about 120 million tons. I think that's actually maybe double that if you look at the slide. And the amount of oil that's been produced from that is unknown. I tried to see if that was easily available, could not find that. So what this pie chart on the right is showing you is that because Chute Creek and many others like it is so closely tied to the oil industry, if it doesn't make economic sense to sell your CO2 to an oil producer who wants it for enhanced oil recovery, there's not really a lot of incentive to do anything with it, like store it. So oftentimes it will just be vented, which means it's emitted into the atmosphere anyway. And so that's what folks who have studied this seem to think has happened. So about half of it, of what has been captured, was just vented back into the atmosphere. 114 million tons, was captured and then sold for enhanced oil recovery. And some of that, about 3%, was actually stored in the oil reservoir. Next, we've got the Great Plains Synfuels plant in Beulah, North Dakota. It's owned and operated by the Dakota Gasification Company, which is a subsidiary of Basin Electric Power. Like I mentioned earlier, the facility itself was built in 1984, but the carbon capture equipment wasn't operational until 2000. Cost $2 billion. The CO2 sources from within the process of lignite coal being created and turned into synthetic natural gas. It's able to capture about 3 million tons per year. And the end use is enhanced oil recovery in the Weyburn oil fields in Saskatchewan. To date, they've captured about 40 million tons and about 104 million barrels of oil have been obtained through enhanced oil recovery as of 2020. So obviously it's probably a little higher. The website for the Synfuels plant states that it anticipates that CO2 EOR will enable an additional 130 million barrels of oil to be produced, extending the field's commercial life by around 25 years. And up to 20 million tons will be permanently sequestered, which is only about half of what was actually, of what's been captured to date. All right, we're almost there, I promise. This is the last one. This is the Archer Daniels Midland project. It's in Decatur, Illinois. This was actually kind of two projects. So the first one was from 2011 to 2014 that captured and sequestered 1 million tons of CO2, and then that's undergoing ongoing monitoring. But the second part, it became operational in 2017. The source of the CO2 is ethanol processing, which we'll hear more about later today. And while it was proposed to capture and sequester about 1 million tons per year, it's really only capturing about 500,000 tons per year. And unlike the other ones I've described, the end use is actual geologic sequestration in a saline reservoir. But unfortunately, after this carbon capture technology was installed and became operational, overall facility emissions actually increased, as you can see from the graph over there. And I'll just note that the top dark line is overall CO2 emissions from the facility. So even if it was capturing at its anticipated rate, we're still 3.5 emissions off. That's not the unit, sorry. 3.5 emissions, that's all. Yes, thank you. All right, so what's the point of all of this way too fast information that I've thrown at you? History does not mean future or even current success. Just because something has been around for 50 plus years doesn't mean that it's been successful. You need to really look at each facility and the claims that are being made. Unfortunately, carbon capture has consistently underperformed. It's been proven to be energy intensive and expensive, not only for companies, but for taxpayers. And the majority of CO2 that is being captured and used right now is being used for enhanced oil recovery to produce oil that would have otherwise been inaccessible. So I just want to end with saying carbon capture as it exists today cannot be used as a tool to delay rapid, deep decarbonization. It was very quick. Again, please come up and see me if you have questions. Thank you so much.